Good evening. I want to welcome you all to LaRouchePAC's Saturday Night Class Series. I'm Susan Kokinda. Tonight I'll be joined by Bob Ingram, who will be launching a new 3 or possibly 4-part series on the principles and the practice of national banking. Many of you, I hope, watched the short video excerpt that went out as part of the invitation to tonight's event, which was a less than 3-minute excerpt from our founder, Lyndon LaRouche, delivered over 13 years ago in 2009, where he made the point that the British Empire rules over nations using war and using money. And unfortunately, the Biden collective and its global controllers are making our job a little bit easier because it is so obvious how they are using the war question as they invited literally this conflict in Ukraine so that they could use it to try and tighten their global control over the world, which is not working very well for them at this point. But also the fact that the only tool they seem to have in their arsenal, or frankly, the only tool they do have in their arsenal, is the manipulation of money. And that tool is failing miserably. We saw this week that Joe Biden assured us that he is going to be taking on the question of inflation, but first and foremost, he assured us that he will be protecting the independence and the sanctity of the Federal Reserve, and said that over and over again in his initial statement last Tuesday, promising us that things were going to get better. Now, we are the primary group in the United States right now actively waging a campaign to not only violate the independence of the Federal Reserve, but to shut it down, to abolish it, to repeal the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, and return to a principle of national banking. So Biden's blurting out, and it was bolstered by his Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, we will not touch a hair on the head of the Federal Reserve, I think is a certain amount of perhaps whistling past the graveyard, because they have a sense of the growing receptivity, which we're finding as we go out amongst the population and talk to candidates all over the country about the absolute necessity to return to American principles of banking and get rid of the imperial principles of banking that we surrendered to in 1913. But Biden's blurting out of his embrace of the Fed didn't stand alone. The next day, our poor Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, announced that she really didn't understand the threat of inflation. And she frankly doesn't understand much of anything else. I think the Babylon Bee, the satire magazine, did it very well. They had a post of her reading, of Janet Yellen reading the book Economics for Dummies. But then that wasn't even enough. Her confession that she knows nothing wasn't enough. The next day, Biden came back and he gave us another speech, which is literally through the looking glass. We were not the only ones who described it as bizarre, because he declared that since he took office, quote, families are carrying less debt, their average savings are up, and more Americans feel financially comfortable. Now, anybody who bothers to spend 30 seconds looking at reality knows that the polar opposite is the case in all of those. That I think the one poll shows anxiety over finances and money and the economy is hitting 80% of the population. And we know that savings have been wiped out by inflation, by the COVID lockdowns and everything else. But just to sort of intensify the Mad Hatter quality of what this poor creature occupying the White House said, he's promised us that his goal is to ensure that at the end of the month, families will have a little more breathing room than they have now. So I know I'm going to sleep better tonight. But a little bit closer to reality was the warning of Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, who warned of the coming economic hurricane. But of course, his advice was simply brace yourself, because they have no tools. Embedded in the central banking system, which Bob is going to discuss tonight, the tools simply do not exist to address the magnitude of the crisis. Now, as bad as this bunch of clowns and criminals are, we can't put all of the blame on them, because we can put a lot of it, and whatever is due, they should be blamed for. But this has been a long time coming. This is the final outcome of an empire-based system of central banking, which our nation unfortunately surrendered to in 1913, as Bob is going to develop. The failure of it is embedded in its actual principles. It's embedded in its view of man. It's embedded in how it seeks to organize an economy. It is doomed to fail. It may take a century and some years to fail, as we're seeing right now. But embedded in it is the seeds of its own destruction. And it behooves us to extricate ourselves from that failing system before it's too late. That is why we've relaunched a campaign to abolish the Federal Reserve, restore our economic sovereignty by reestablishing American system principles of national banking. And for people who may be joining us for the first time or viewing this on YouTube, I do just want to share my screen and show people the page that we have on our website, which is under the tab Bankrupt the Fed, which has our resolution, a resolution which we are calling on candidates, sitting elected officials, constituency leaders, and others to endorse. And I'm happy to report that we have numbers of candidates, congressional candidates, state legislative candidates, some statewide candidates throughout the United States. And over the course of the next week, we'll be posting those endorsements so that people can see who the political leaders are who do have the courage to stand up and join this fight. And for many of us who've been organizing around these principles for many, many decades, I think it's safe to say that this is an idea whose time has come, or a principle whose time has come. Since the Federal Reserve was created, there were people who knew that it was evil and it was wrong. And throughout the over 100 years it's existed, there have been people who have understood that. But we have something now that I don't think had existed at any time in the previous 100 odd some years since the Federal Reserve was founded. And that is, we have a growing movement, unlike I think anything that we've seen since the time of Abraham Lincoln, of citizens, of candidates who are doing more than resisting, who are beginning to realize they have to take responsibility for knowing how to run the country and for knowing how to run the economy. And if you put three elements together, I think the pathway to victory, to restore our sovereignty, to put back into office people who are committed to this nation, and frankly, who are committed to humanity and not committed to an evil financier elite, I think we're very close to that. Those three things are, you need leadership. And at the national level, obviously that's represented by Donald Trump. You need a citizens movement. And we are seeing that growing and strengthening and educating itself every single day. And you need big ideas. And that's what we're bringing into this fight. The challenge to people to think very big, that we are at a point in history when we can make the kind of historic changes that Abraham Lincoln made and that Alexander Hamilton made. which is why we have called our current fight the fight for a third American economic revolution. But it is critical to understand what that revolution is against as well. And Bob is going to open up our series tonight by giving us a deeper sense of what it is our economic revolution represented and what it was a revolution against. And he's also going to give us a bit of a preview in terms of what the subsequent classes will be on, which will fall more under the heading of the practice of national banking. That is, how do we actually put these ideas to work in the current crisis? So, Bob, I'm ready to turn it over to you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Ingram, for those who don't know me. So, yes, we're beginning a series on the question of national banking. Now, before I get into the heart of the subject matter, I want to just mention 2 or 3 things very, very briefly. The first is that Susan mentioned the video we sent out in the email. And in fact, there are 2 videos by LaRouche, which we have featured lately. Both are short. Both deal with this subject of national banking and central banking and the British Empire. One is the short video that Susan sent out with the email, and perhaps many of you have already viewed that. And second is the video that we showed 2 weeks ago at the class we held 2 weeks ago. And I believe Susan will post links to both of those videos in the chat during the meeting here. And I mention this because I really want to encourage everyone who is in this meeting to watch both of those videos. What I'm going to present tonight is derived directly from what LaRouche says in those videos. And it's anyway, they'll be posted, and I urge you all to view them and forward the link to those videos to as many people as you have in your network and otherwise are working with politically. They're a real education. Now, the second thing I want to mention, and I just want to mention this briefly, it has nothing directly to do with the class tonight, but I do want to just remind people, and perhaps many of you don't need a reminder. We canceled our class last week because of the Memorial Day weekend, and we are now only a few days past, or almost a week past, that Memorial Day weekend. And I want to mention this because Memorial Day is a very special holiday. And there are a lot of Americans today, probably none on this call, but there are a lot of Americans today who don't even know what the Memorial Day holiday is really all about. As some of you probably know, Memorial Day was originally, for about the first 50 years of its celebration, it was called Decoration Day. And it emerged as a national holiday after the Civil War to honor the Civil War dead. It was first celebrated in cities and localities and then states, and eventually became a national holiday. And it was called Decoration Day because that was the day in which people, citizens, went to the graveyards of those who have given their lives in combat for our nation and left flowers and other memorial items on the graves of the fallen veterans. It is a very special holiday because it honors those who have given their lives in the service of our nation. Now, on the one hand, it is the case that if you look at the wars we have waged in recent years under George W. Bush, Barack Obama, the kind of stuff Biden is doing now, most of these are bad wars. In fact, they're all bad wars. They have been denounced by Donald Trump, among others. They serve the interests of the oligarchy, not our nation. But regardless of that, every veteran who has fallen in combat is someone who has paid the ultimate price, sacrificed their life in defense of our republic. And they certainly need to be both remembered and honored. And I bring it up not just to honor them, but I bring it up also because we ourselves find ourselves engaged in political combat. And sometimes people get weary of combat and they say, I've done enough, I've given enough, what more can I do? Probably most of us have felt that at one time or another. And to me, if you look at the Americans who laid down their lives for this country, and you think of the sacrifice of what they made, then I think we can all answer the question that none of us have done enough yet, that there is more that each of us can do to rescue our nation and to create a better future. So that's not quite a sermon, but I did want to say that. Now, the third brief thing I just want to mention is what Susan also mentioned, which is this is the first in a series of classes, and it's going to be followed next week by a class by Brian Lance. And actually, I hope Brian will do at least 2 classes, which may come as a surprise to him. But Brian has just issued a report, which we are going to be posting a link to on the LaRouchePAC website sometime this week, so it will be available for download. It is a lengthy report on what has happened to the U.S. economy over the last, particularly, let's say, the last 20 years. You could go back earlier, but let's just limit it to the last 20 years. The absolute destruction of our productive economy, and how we can reverse this through national banking methods, through constitutional banking methods. And I will just say, I'm not going to try to, at all present what Brian does in his report, but it is in depth. He goes through energy, water, transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, healthcare, education. And what he presents is staggering. And I would, argue, because I certainly was taken aback by the depth of what he presented, I would argue that there is probably no one in this meeting tonight who really has a full picture of what has been done. I mean, we see the economic destruction today. We see the inflation. We see the shortages. We see, all of the things that we know are going on. But what we see today, this is the smallest tip of the iceberg of what has been done to our economy. We have literally been destroyed as a nation in the last 20 years. The heart of our productive economy has been ripped out. It's been murdered by the policies of the Federal Reserve and the central banking system. And we have no future if we do not reverse this process. No future if we do not reverse it. And it can't be reversed if we continue to allow the Federal Reserve to run our banking and monetary system. So I say this to urge everyone to come back next week for Brian's classes, his first class, and to organize as many of your friends and associates as you can. People must know this material. So that's it in terms of the introductory remarks. What I'm going to go through tonight is really just to try to plant some ideas in people's minds. This is not going to be an in-depth presentation. For those of you who know how to navigate the LaRouchePAC website, I have in the past done a series of classes and written a series of articles on national banking, central banking, Abraham Lincoln, etc. And that material is available. But I really have a more modest goal tonight, which is to just try to get people to think about a couple of key things. And it generally falls in two categories. First, the delusions that most people have about economics, about banking, about finance. Our culture is dominated by really insane delusions about these matters. And the second thing is to just sort of present the question, which is what type of economic system is demanded by our Constitution? What is a constitutional economic system for the American Republic? And I'm not going to answer those two questions in depth tonight, but I just want to try to present a little material which will get people to start thinking about some of this. You look at the way you look at what is presented in the media about finance and banking and economics today. And what do you have? You have the Federal Reserve, you have the stock market, you have the banking institutions, you have the private equity funds, the shadow banking institutions, you have all of this stuff. And this is sort of just plopped out there as this is the way it is. This is what our system is, right? It's always been this way. It's always going to be this way. This is free market American capitalism. This is our system, right? And people sort of take all of this as a given, as axiomatic, as this is the system we live under. And, clearly it's not working right, right now. Clearly there's big problems, but the system itself is sort of untouchable. And, what people will say is, well, we've got corruption, we've got bailouts of the big bankers. They'll point to all of the little evils, all of the little corrupt deals, all of the bailouts, all of the greed by certain individuals. They'll point to this and say, well, if we can correct these things, then we can, go back to a healthier economy. We can go back to what's normal. But the system itself is, like I said, untouchable. It's a given. This is the system we live within. Now, that's a humongous error to think that way. There is nothing constitutional about the system we live in right now. There is nothing rational about the system right now. The Federal Reserve System, the central banking system, and the entire system of domination by private, speculative elite financial institutions is both entirely unconstitutional and it is a system which is the opposite of what we need if we are going to be able to have a growing, productive economy. Now, the fact is, as I already stated, the economic crisis that is becoming more and more apparent today is just the tip of the iceberg. What is really occurring, and you're beginning to see discussion of this, Susan mentioned the quote from Jamie Dimon, and I'm going to mention a few more quotes. But what we're beginning to see sort of coming up, bubbling to the surface, is a realization that this entire imperial financial system is crumbling, that we are in the worst crisis within our lifetimes, and probably a lot longer than that. We are now in a crisis, facing a crisis, a banking crisis, a financial crisis, and most importantly, a physical economic crisis, far, far worse than 2008. And it's coming on fast. And the Biden administration is clueless, as Susan already said. Just within recent days, both Joe Biden and his Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, have declared their undying allegiance to the Federal Reserve, so they have no clue and no intention to try to fix this. So it's up to us. It's up to the movement that we're building. It's up to the candidates who are now running for office all over the country. We have got to put forward the solutions to this. What we are dealing with is a diseased and a terminally ill oligarchical financial system. And I stress terminally ill. So in that regard, I want to begin with a quotation. It's fun, and people will hear it. It's taken from, it's a very short section, one paragraph, taken from Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Fall of the House of Usher. This is not to say that this is what the short story is about, but I thought this paragraph was appropriate. And just so it's clear to you, the term, the story is entitled The Fall of the House of Usher, and the term the House of Usher has a dual meaning. On the one hand, it refers to the members, it refers to the actual physical house. They're living in this big castle-like mansion, gigantic mansion, which is the House of Usher. It's the building. But on the other hand, it also refers to the family members, in the way that, the British royalty are collectively called the House of Windsor. And the House of Windsor is made up of the members of the House of Windsor. So the House of Usher is both the building and the family itself. And anyway, let me just read the quote. It goes, excuse me. This is the protagonist speaking. I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal feature seemed to be that of excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine tangled webwork from the eaves. Yet all of this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the crumbling condition of the individual stones. In this, there was much that reminded me of the specious totality of old woodwork, which has rotted for long years in some neglected vault, with no disturbance from the breath of the external air. Beyond this indication of extensive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the Tarn. So that's the end of the quote. And just to repeat, Poe says, the fabric gave little token of instability, yet there was a perceptible fissure, zigzagging, running down through the whole edifice, the entire edifice, threatened with collapse. And, that really is where we are today. Janet Yellen gets up and gives a speech. Jamie Dimon gets up and gives a speech. Someone else gets up and gives a speech. We have these institutions which have served us, the Federal Reserve, the major Wall Street banks, this, that, and the other thing, all powerful, enormous, immense. They've withstood, the rigors of time. They're still standing, yet there is a fissure running through the entire edifice. It's rotten, and it is ready to come collapsing down around us. Now, this reality is beginning to sink in with people. The enormity of the crisis is beginning to sink in with people. And I want to just reference, a few quotations before I move on. These are not the most important thing in the world, but they're an indication of the nervousness and going beyond nervousness to near panic, which is beginning to set in among some of the, quote, elites, some of the most powerful, some of the most, prominent spokesmen for the oligarchy. I mean, first is the just concluded World Economic Forum, which took place just a couple of weeks ago in Davos, Switzerland. Now, I have monitored these forums for a few years now, and let me tell you, this was unlike any World Economic Forum that I have, witnessed over the last several years. The entire atmosphere was one of doom and gloom. It was started off with Klaus Schwab, the big buffoon, saying, quote, the return of war, epidemics, and the climate crisis, all those disruptive forces have derailed the global recovery. Now, that itself is a vast understatement, but that sort of set the tone that everything they have been trying to do, all of their well-laid plans, are being derailed by the crisis which is now hitting the world economy. And then you had people like Jane Fraser, who's the CEO of Citigroup, and Kristalina Georgieva, who is the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, both giving doom and gloom speeches at Davos. Georgieva, speaking for the IMF, asked how many more unthinkables are going to come, because they're being hit by these crises one after another. A day after the Davos summit concluded, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, published an article entitled "The Death of Davos," in which he said that all of the work of the globalists, everything they've been trying to do, is now unraveling. It's now beginning to crumble because of the escalating global crisis. Then, of course, that takes us to what Susan referenced, which was the statement by the speech by Jamie Dimon who is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, on June 1st, that's just 3 days ago, in which he said, right now it's kind of sunny. Things out there are doing, out there down the road, things out there are doing fine. Everyone thinks that the Federal Reserve can handle this, but the hurricane is right out there. It's coming our way. Brace yourself. That's Jamie Dimon. And in remarks that received less publicity, the day after Jamie Dimon's speech on June 2nd, the day before yesterday, the president of Goldman Sachs, John Waldron, issued a statement endorsing Dimon's remarks and saying, quote, the confluence of the number of shocks to the system is unprecedented. So there you have, the head of JP Morgan Chase and the head of Goldman Sachs, two of the leading institutions in the financial establishment, both saying within the last 72 hours that a hurricane is coming, that the shocks are unprecedented. So this is where we are. This is where we find ourselves. And this is going to continue to escalate. Now, you can't trust anything these people say. You can't trust what Jamie Dimon says. You can't trust what John Waldron says. You can't trust what any of these people within the financial establishment say. And you certainly can't trust their motives or what they intend to do about this crisis. But increasingly, they are recognizing that this crisis is here, that the entire structure is in danger of coming down. So this is where we're at. We are essentially living through the first stages of the death throes of this oligarchical financial system. These are death throes. This system is dying. The only question is, what comes next? There's no going back to, let me put it to you this way. There's no going back even to what we had under Trump, to what Trump was doing, because we are in a different situation right now where, despite the positive things Trump did to get aluminum production going, steel production going, make us energy independent, all of these things were great. But we're in a different situation now, 20 to 30 to 40 years in the making. And it's all coming home to roost. So look, as I said, I want to sort of keep this a little short. And the first, well, outside of what I've said so far, the next subject I want to move on to is this question of what really is the nature of this system that is now dying. What is it that we're talking about? That is one of the reasons why I mentioned and encouraged people to watch these two videos by Lyndon LaRouche, which we've just posted. Because there's no way to understand either what is occurring. You may think you know what is occurring, but there is no way to really understand what is occurring. And there is certainly no way to understand what needs to be done if you don't understand the difference between a constitutional republic and a financial empire. And this is a problem, in that most people do not understand this. They simply have not grasped what the key issue is that needs to be understood. Now, as LaRouche went through in those two videos, and as we've presented in a lot of other material, when you look at the central banking system, when you look at the British financial empire and its appendages around the world. What you're dealing with is an oligarchical monetary and financial empire that goes back millennia. It's not new. It goes back to Rome. It goes back even earlier than Rome. And one of the things that LaRouche presented in the video from 2 weeks ago is that people have the wrong idea about empire. Again, what people think they know about this, and I hope I'm not insulting someone, but what people think they know about this is simply not correct. People think of empires as a powerful nation ruling over other nations. The Spanish Empire had its colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, etc. France had its colonies, Vietnam, etc., Algeria. Great Britain had its colonies. Portugal had its colonies. That an empire is a nation that rules over colonies or rules over other nations. That's not the actual nature of empire. All empires are monetary financial systems, oligarchical monetary and financial empires, which rule as a system of financial oligarchy over nations, including the host nation. Like, for example, today we talk about the British Empire, but the British Empire is not an empire of the British nation. And in fact, the British nation is a subject of that empire. The empire is an empire of a financial oligarchy, the worst of which happens to be located in the city of London. But it is a international financial oligarchy which rules over nations and imposes their will on nations through banking, through control over raw materials, through control over world trade, through international organizations like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and things like this. It is an international financial empire. People use the term globalist, but globalist is a bad term because it misidentifies what a financial empire really is. You can learn some things by using the term globalist, but fundamentally, it's very imprecise. You're dealing with a financial empire. Now, the modern day form of this empire, I said it went back millennia. LaRouche said it went back millennia. But the modern day form of the central banking empire, which exists today, originated in Venice in the late 16th century, early 17th century. And from Venice, those banking methods and financial and monetary methods spread first to Amsterdam with the creation of the Bank of Amsterdam, and then into England after 1688 with the creation of the Bank of England and what's historians call the British Financial Revolution. What was created was a system of oligarchical financial power, which is rooted in money and the oligarchy's control over money. As Susan mentioned, the British Empire has been based on war and money, and one of the problems we face today, and it's a deep problem with a lot of people, is they are incapable of thinking about economics without thinking about money. They want to come up with money schemes Well, what if we do this? What if we do that? What if we have cryptocurrency? What if we have something else? What if we, have some kind of independent money system, independent of the oligarchy? And if you're thinking that way, you're trapped. Because real economics, and I can't stress this enough, real economics is not about money at all. Money has been used by the financial oligarchy to run their empire. But money within a constitutional republic has an entirely different nature than what people think of it as today. The problem is, this is what you could call the British problem, as a psychological problem, as a mental problem within the people, within the citizenry. That people have been miseducated as to the nature of the American Republic. You look at this stuff that is very prevalent today. If you go to a university, now Hillsdale College is a prime example of this, but I don't want to just, beat on Hillsdale College, because they are by no means alone in this. This is almost universal. If you go to a university today and you want to learn about the American Revolution, the American Republic, our constitutional system of government, et cetera, our economic system, what does it really mean to be an American? What is America all about? What you are taught is British philosophy and British economics. And you are told that this is the basis for the United States of America. This is widespread, from the Ivy League colleges all the way down to the private colleges, including liberal and conservative alike. Right? It's all a lie. None of it is true. I'm stating that flat out, but this is something that I personally have studied for almost 50 years. And I know that what is taught in universities is simply a lie. It's not true. What they will teach you is that John Locke was the greatest influence on the American Revolution. Now, John Locke in 1688 was one of the key people who brought in the system of central banking. Well, it wasn't called central banking then, but John Locke was key to the creation of the Bank of England. He was one of the major players of the British economic revolution, which brought the entire oligarchical system of money into London after 1688. In the years before the American Revolution, the two greatest influences on the young Benjamin Franklin, the two most important philosophical influences on the young Benjamin Franklin when he was in his 20s and 30s, were two men, Cotton Mather and James Logan. And I believe we're going to have a class at some point in the future on James Logan, someone who almost no one knows about today. Logan was key. Cotton Mather and James Logan, who greatly influenced Franklin, were bitter enemies of John Locke. They wrote articles denouncing John Locke and what he stood for. Locke had nothing to do with the American Revolution. And from Locke, you get into, there's a sort of a line of progression. You get into what's called 19th century British liberalism. And this includes, and liberal was used differently than it's used today. Didn't have the same kind of meaning people give it today. But you get into 19th century British liberalism. And this is, Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, James Mill. There's a whole bunch of these guys. You can go on and on and on and on and on. And, you know, people read this stuff in school. They're taught Adam Smith is the basis for the American economic methods. They're taught James Mill or John Stuart Mill, whichever one it was that wrote on democracy. This is the guy who really put forward the ideas that are contained in American democracy and what have you. None of this is true. Now, if you look at all of these people, you know, if you look at John Locke, if you look at Isaac Newton, who was also involved in this, if you look at Adam Smith, if you look at Thomas Malthus, if you look at Jeremy Bentham, if you look at the Mills, the two Mills, if you look at all of these people, you know, and you actually go and read a little bit about their lives, this is not me just saying this, you could look it up. Every single one of these people either was a member of, worked for the, you know, the Bank of England, the British Foreign Office, the Crown Mint, the British East India Company, the Board of Trade, or they were a member of the Privy Council. They worked for them. They were paid by them. They were paid employees. The check stubs exist to prove it. They were paid employees of the highest institutions of the British Empire. Every one of them. So is this what America is based on? Is this, you know, what we're talking about? No, what these people put forward, they represented the oligarchy. And go back to John Locke for a second. People think John Locke, he put forward, you know, the idea of human freedom. Human freedom, as Madison talked about, as Jefferson talks about. Human freedom. This comes from John Locke. Now, I'll ask people who are on the call tonight, how many of you have ever read John Locke's two treatises on government? I've read it 3 times. You know, it's almost damaged my mind irreparably. John Locke's two treatises of government, which he wrote, I think, in 1688, 1689, this is where he puts forward his notion of human freedom. He does have a notion of human freedom. This is where he puts it forward. What does he say in the two treatises of government? He says, human beings are born into nature just like the wild beasts. The wild beasts, hyenas, wolves, pigs, whatever. We're born into nature like wild beasts. And our rights flow from our existence as a wild beast in nature. You know, a beast has the right to life, and he has the right to defend his life. A beast has the right to liberty, can run around, do whatever he wants, you know, like dogs used to do before they had leash laws. You know, he has the right to life, he has the right to liberty, and he has the right to property. You know, if he kills, if a you know, animal goes out and kills another animal and has the carcass, that carcass belongs to him. You know, these are the rights of wild beasts. And Locke says this is the source of all rights that human beings have. This is the essence of human freedom, right? That's John Locke's notion of liberty and rights. The rights of wild animals, right? Now, is that what's put forward in the Declaration of Independence? I don't think so. Is that what's put forward in the preamble of our Constitution to form a more perfect union, to protect and defend the general welfare of all of the people? This is not John Locke, you know? And people have been spoon-fed this stuff. They've been spoon-fed these oligarchical nostrums and told, this is America. It's not America. We're a constitutional republic. committed to the development of the people and the posterity, future generations. And well, this sort of takes me to my second thing, but I want to cut this short actually, because we're supposed to be talking about national banking, and I can't get into it in depth tonight. We'll have, the discussion will be wide open for anyone who wants to ask questions. But as people know, Alexander Hamilton created the first national bank of the United States. It was called the Bank of the United States at the time. And that was around 1791 or so. But actually, Hamilton had put forward this idea 10 years earlier. In 1781, Hamilton wrote a letter to Robert Morris, who was then the superintendent of finance for the continental government. And this is during the Revolutionary War, 1781, while the war is still going on. And Morris is the head of the finance department for the revolutionary government. And Hamilton wrote a letter to Robert Morris in which he proposes the creation of a national bank. And if you read it and then go back through what he proposes 10 years later in his report on a national bank, it's remarkable how similar it is. It's not identical. He fine-tuned it, he learned some things, but it's very, very similar. And in terms of its intention, what he's laying out, what the role of the national bank is, it's identical. That intention all exists in the letter that Hamilton wrote in 1781. And I want to, I'm not going to go through it. I mean, Hamilton in this letter to Morris goes through a 20-point argument of why we need a national bank. And it's literally, they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. He goes through 20 points of why we need a national bank. And I'm not going to go through that, obviously, for time reasons. But I want to just read you one quote when he's talking about, what the purpose of a national bank is. And this is just, a couple of sentences. He says, "The tendency of a national bank is to increase public and private credit. The former gives power to the state for the protection of its rights and interests, and the latter facilitates and extends the operation of commerce among individuals. Industry is increased, commodities are multiplied, agriculture and manufactures flourish, and therein consist the true wealth and prosperity of a state." Now I want to repeat those final words. Therein consist the true wealth and prosperity of a state. The true wealth of a state is not in the money. It's in the manufacturers. It's in the agriculture. It's in the commerce. It's in the commodities. It's in the industry. The wealth of a nation lies in its productive economy. And this is where you have to escape the trap, the jail of money. The wealth of a nation, unlike what Adam Smith says, the employee of the British Empire, the wealth of a nation is not in its money. The wealth of a nation is in what it produces, is in its technologically progressive, productive economy. And Hamilton lays that all out in 1781. And then he not only repeats that in his report on a national bank in 1791, he lays out first in 1781, but then he not only repeats that 10 years later, but then he writes the report on manufacturers, in which he spends almost the entire report discussing how this credit system that he is creating, and he created it, how this credit system he is creating, how it's going to be used to launch a historic revolution in terms of building up and unleashing the productive economic potential of the country. This is what a constitutional economic system is. It's not a system that serves financial speculators. It is a system which is entirely oriented towards building up the productive economy. Now, I have more notes here, but I'm going to skip them because I want to leave as much time as possible for discussion. But there's just one final topic I want to make sure I touch on, which is to ask people to think about this in a different kind of way, right? Get out of the realm of banking and finance entirely, right? Think about what's happening to the fabric of American society right now. And it's not just going on in America, it's going on all over the world, but let's focus on the United States. We've seen, the recent school shootings in Texas and New York. We've seen a lot of other shootings. We've seen, the government statistics that last year more than 100,000 young Americans, almost entirely, maybe not entirely, but overwhelmingly, young Americans died last year, more than 100,000 from drug overdoses. We're seeing an unbelievable rise in youth suicides, primarily, again, not entirely, but primarily youth suicides, with the majority, and I think it's a substantial majority of those suicides coming from young women. Obviously, we've got even more lunatic things like this transgender stuff. But if you just look at the body count, the shootings, the suicides, the drug overdoses, we are clearly in more than just an economic crisis. We are in an existential crisis at this moment as to, it's a moral crisis. It's an existential crisis about whether our culture, our Republican culture, is going to survive, whether it can be revived. But I want to make a point about why, and people may be shocked by this, why this issue of national banking is relevant to this overall crisis we're seeing in the country. Not just inflation, but to the cultural crisis we're seeing in the country. We're not going to be able to reverse this, without getting rid of central banking, without going back to national banking. What do we need? We need to rebuild family life. We need what you could call productive families. We need families with single payer households, or at least 1.5 payer households, where parents are able to spend a substantial amount of time supervising and raising their children. We need households with an income, where people are able to, to productively raise their children. We need an economy which is optimistic, where we're going to the moon, where we're building things. You will see in next week's class, when Brian goes through some of the projects we can undertake breathtaking projects to begin to rebuild this country. We need to, we can recruit. Brian's going to go through something called the Space CCC camps. I don't want to, spoil his surprises, but where we can begin to, recruit literally millions and millions of teenagers and young adults into projects to begin to rebuild the United States. We need to give young people a future. We need to be able to create a situation in which they can perceive that future, in which they are recruited into that, in participating in that productive future. We need to have families which function, families with a decent income, families with productive employment. There is no way we're going to be able to do any of this. There is no way we're going to be able to offer our young people a productive future given the collapse of this financial empire that is underway right now. We have to abolish the Federal Reserve. We can fund all of these things. People say, where's the money going to come from? Under a national banking policy, under a Lincoln Greenback policy, the federal government can issue as credit, as sovereign credit, as much money as is required to build the productive economy. There's no financial limit on how much money you can print. That's just not true. There is a physical limit. If you're going to build, factories, dams, nuclear power plants, farms, energy facilities, transportation facilities, high-speed rail, if you're going to invest into the productive economy, you can print as much money as you need to do that. Because that's where the wealth exists. The wealth exists in building such a productive economy. And that's the only future for ourselves, our families, our children, and for the nation. And it has to be done. And I would argue it is the central issue facing the nation right now. So I'll stop there and we can open it up for discussion.